This is an interview. My name is José Alemán, and I am with Pastor Don Nanstad, a Lutheran priest from East Boston, our Savior Lutheran Church. We are at the church, at the temple, and first of all, we want to concentrate on you in East Boston with your family, arriving, being part of the community, and witnessing the changes, accompanying the changes. Could you tell us how was your arrival in East Boston, and what role did your family play in you landing in East Boston?
Well, I heard about that there was a church in East Boston that didn't have a pastor, hadn't had a pastor for a couple of years. I had been accepted with, my tuition paid at Boston University, but how was I going to go to Boston University? But then that turned up all at once. There was this church. So I came out here, interviewed, was so depressed by what I saw, I had to go back to the hotel, lay down and rest. It was hot, it was dirty, it had an ominous sense of sheer disorder, which was exactly right. It was 1980. Crime was at a very high level, highest probably ever since. And there was just something that just radiated of just disorder, and whatever causes all of that was so apparent. That summer, we spent a long time trying to decide, could we do this? Because it was also another place in Evanston, Illinois, much closer. And we had a tornado, and the lights were out for days, and we were sitting by the lantern, camping lantern in the living room. And finally my wife said, after many, many days, she said, well, why don't we go to Boston? It was just like that. It was a toss-up. So we came here in the end of the summer of 1980, arrived during the rush hour with a car that had broken down, and somebody had to drive my family in. I'm driving a truck, and the first act of that it was anything better than I thought was to arrive, and it was a 90-year-old Italian woman guarding the parking space outside for hours. They had put up some things, and she was guarding it for us. So we moved in, and Boston University, in my mind, was a bust. It was not at all what it should have done. East Boston was tough, and this neighborhood in particular. And I had girls 9 and 5 with where do you play, where do you go outside without getting into problems, which they did right away. And the school system was, at that point, extremely weak, and here go my daughters into that school system. So it was a very hard landing coming to East Boston. But after about 2 years, everything changed. 2 Catholic sisters whom I knew, who were putting together EBEC, East Boston Ecumenical Community Council. It was 5 churches, 3 little churches and Holy Redeemer. 2 Catholic sisters, and one day they said, could we set up some space over here? They said, we're tired of fighting with Gus. Gus Carvelli was the priest at Holy Redeemer, and he was the vicar of East Boston. He was this small, funny man. He was just so likable. He was really kind and generous, but very conservative. And he had fired these 2 nuns 5 times and rehired them 5 times. And they said, we could work better here. That opened the doors. People at New City Ministries, one from Camden, New Jersey, and one from Quincy. And they had done lots of activist work. And all at once the community was pouring in the front doors here. And suddenly, it just looked different. And it was much more interesting. A few years later, I wasn't going anywhere.
How was the community responding to the changes? New immigrants communities coming, crime as you describe it. How was the community participating in those changes?
Well, about 2 to 3 years before we arrived was in the midst of the busing crisis. And white kids weren't bussed out of East Boston, as I understand, but black kids were bussed in. Buses were met with bottles thrown at them by adults, And there was a lot of violence in Maverick. There were about something like 100 people who lived in Maverick housing development, and there were a number of Molotov cocktail fire bombings of those apartments, and most of those people fled somewhere about 1978 or 7, thereabout, before we came. So that there was a lot of tension around black-white issues in Boston and East Boston as well. It was there, as well as East Boston led the city in the highest level of assaults. Now that just mostly was fights between whoever, but nevertheless, it was a rough neighborhood, and the attitude was, well, it seemed to me the attitude was, you don't come here, you don't belong here. And I didn't really get that, but it was obviously not my Boston accent, my Midwest Wisconsin accent. People would say, you're not from here, are you? We went up to the high school, and it was reported to us later, here come the yuppies. Yeah, we were yuppies. So it wasn't bad for us. But we knew we were in a neighborhood that was pretty tense and not open much in most cases, or at least in a lot of cases, to people who were different. And at that point, it had been black families who had been driven out. There were modest, very modest level of Latin Americans who'd been here, in some cases for years.
How about South Asians, Cambodians, Vietnamese?
2 summers later, 1982, we made a decision to be sponsors, typical church work, you know. Sponsor, they said no less than 4 families. We like clusters of families. And we said, we'll do it if EBAC will work with us. This new organization had just moved in. We were too small, didn't have the resources. I thought it was too dangerous to bring Cambodians here. And finally, Hannah Gerhardt prevailed on all of us, and it made sense. So in the summer, we made a decision. The first families arrived in December. I remember seeing them get off the plane. I thought, oh, they are dark. And I thought, they're just going to draw attention to the racial difference, which they did. There were any number of minor harassments, firecrackers thrown in the front door, and the whole family hit the floor. They lived so much violence that they immediately reacted to bombings. Some other things, and we had to get involved with the police department. But initially it wasn't too big, and then a couple of years later, the levels of violence began to increase against harassment primarily of families, you know, without injuries, but with really a lot of threat.
What was Boston offering as opportunities for new arrivals, like new immigrants? Was the city of Boston prosperous enough to provide jobs? What was the magnet for people to come to Boston?
Well,
and especially to East Boston.
Well, for an instance of Cambodians or Vietnamese refugees, the only magnet was wherever their sponsor was. You officially sponsored people. You signed up through a local or regional agency who signed up with a federal agency in Washington, and ultimately it was all connected to the State Department. That's how they were approved in the refugee camps. That's how they came through, and whoever was their sponsors. If you were in Keene, New Hampshire, that's where they ended up. So they weren't making a decision of where to go, unless they had families to be reunited with and attempt to find a local sponsor to make that happen. And Boston, it seemed to me that people got jobs. It wasn't long before people said they were working in medical tech and that sort of thing. One woman got a job at the airport in a food service for airlines, and after a couple of weeks, she quit. You get a job, you know. She quit. She said, oh, Pastor, they throw away so much food. I cannot. Because 4 of her family had starved to death under the Khmer Rouge. And this was just such an offense. It wasn't just sort of a moral principle. It was something that she couldn't take it. She couldn't look at it.
The proximity with the airport, what tensions or what opportunities has brought to East Boston, to the residents, to the institutions, to the community?
I can't remember Cambodians or Vietnamese refugees. There must have been some who worked at the airport, but I don't remember that being an immediate draw. When I came here, the airport was still the enemy. There was huge battles with the airport by community activists. It had to do with the taking of Wood Island Park, which was a Frank Lewis, is it Frank Lewis? It's an Olmsted Park, at any rate, up on where Wood Island Station is now. It's a beautiful park, people said. and a very aggressive airport just simply took it, tore down the houses by eminent domain, the trees, everything, and it was just the sense of encroachment. The airport is still 2/3 of all the landmass in East Boston. So there was a tremendous resistance to the airport all the time. That was the issue. Strangely enough, I see housing as the new airport. It's the new encroachment on everything in East Boston.
Do you see families being stable in East Boston? Families that can talk about having a second generation, a third generation, strong residents, being very feeling ownership and secure in East Boston?
When I came here, of course, all the Italians, families that were mostly who were here, overwhelmingly Italian, and they would tell me how nice East Boston had been, not so many years earlier. Apparently, a tremendous economic decline in the same, somewhere around the 70s, maybe probably post-World War II and increasing, but somewhere around the 70s as major businesses moved out and unemployment went up and welfare went up. All the things like crime and drug abuse and alcohol abuse and family problems and such came during that time. And the barber on the corner, Bob Pellegrini, opened that shop in 1965. He grew up here, right in this neighborhood. His father was the state rep from East Boston. And Bob knows everybody. People come in there and they talk. And he said, looks to me like he said, the men had kind of gone to hell around here, and he said, and the women joined him in the 70s. That's the way I see it. So yeah, that was just a short statement. He never explained it, but I got the drift of it. It seemed to me, because I was an outsider and I was observing things and not knowing a lot of the other families around East Boston that were very stable and have been here generations and were doing very well. They had good jobs, the kids were getting educated, etc. But there was a pretty substantial percentage of East Boston, and I think it always seemed to me that around Maverick Square was the largest percentage of it. It had to do with large public housing, poorest and considered the most dangerous part of East Boston. The Navy declared this square 24 hours off limits to sailors the fall we arrived, because of the violence that had been occurring here. And it was triggered partly by race, by a lot of black sailors. They were in town because there was still shipbuilding industries here. There'd be as many as 800 sailors in town at a time. So a lot of it was black, but other people said a lot of it is just, you don't belong here. We don't know you, you know? And so it's a bunch of guys in the corner and a bunch of other young guys walking by them, and off they go. And there'd been a terrible, violent murder that summer. I read about it in Time magazine before I moved here.
Do you see the issue of displacement around the community as a problem, as a threat to the stability and the prosperity of this community? How do you see that the risk of displacement affecting this community?
I think the displacement threat is huge. I don't know, it must have been simply overwhelming in South Boston. I mean, East Boston was often in its own way compared to South Boston as sort of poor ethnic neighborhoods, sort of tight and intact, or at least saw themselves that way. Half of East Boston rent, and it's not public housing. 20,000 people, that's almost nearly exact, rent. Those 20,000 are at very high risk of being displaced when their buildings are bought and converted to condos, when their buildings are bought and the rent goes up 50–60%. I see a lot of it. Nobody knows the number. Greater Boston Legal Service, maybe a year and a half ago, when I asked them, I started to learn more about this, and I said, are we talking 200–300 families in the last couple of years? And they said, no, I think that's on the low end. So maybe 300–400, 500 families in a couple of years, and that was a year and a half ago. So let's say it was 500 families, small families, that's more than 10% of that renter population in a couple of years. You don't do that very long before you have just gutted the lower end of the population of East Boston. Immigrants, everything shows, as you probably well know, statistics and studies around the country show that where neighborhoods have high immigrant populations, they have low crime. It's amazing. It is so much the opposite of what certain perceptions and prejudices are. And I think one of the reasons, well, I'm sure there's a lot of people here who came for opportunity, but also there's a lot of whole families. Now, there are a lot of people broken up, but they come here and they're up against it, and they really, you know, they do rather heroic things, just like the immigrants of generations prior. On this street, five houses sitting vacant in 1992 after the SNL collapse. And I think it was three at least, that were bought by Latin American family owners. And those buildings are in nice shape. They're good neighbors. And your neighborhood started to feel different. Some of the sense of threat to my street went away.
Speaking about your own family and your own safety, how do you feel in this community, being part of this community, on this block, this square, this?
Well, initially I was scared. My wife pointed out, she said, if you're afraid, she says, it may say more about you than it does about the neighborhood. There's a lot to that. Because even now, some people are afraid of Maverick Square, which is kind of crazy. Initially, I just didn't know what I was up against. But now, I've never been assaulted. I've never been attacked. I'm not going to walk around just for fun at 2 a.m. But at midnight, if I have to run across to the store, I think nothing of it. You know, it's not. My house has never been broken into. The church, the only break-in the church has had was a homeless guy was cold and found a window he could get in, and then stayed until the police came and got him. You know, that's not bad for a city neighborhood.
No.
And crime rates went way down. They've gone way down. And I still have some of those stats, I believe.
We are doing this collection of testimonies because we are aware that the community is changing. Some people are moving out. Some new people are coming in. And what have you seen? What images do you have of that transition? Is it indeed happening?
That people are going out? Oh my goodness, yes. I knew that Latin Americans were coming in pretty substantial numbers quite a number of years ago. But I didn't have a real obvious visual take on that until one night I had to walk across Maverick Square to get something on a nice warm night. I looked around, I swear everybody there was speaking Spanish. It was like, come on, it's grown that changed that much? And I said to myself, this isn't gonna last. I figured it would be violent reaction. There really wasn't. It struck me that Latin Americans here have become so strong. Now, they've had their problems. There've been some of that, but it wasn't what I would have guessed it might have been. The history of the place, maybe the place had calmed down a little bit, seeing that some of the changes didn't hurt them so much as they thought they did. We had about 800 Southeast Asian refugees in East Boston. They faced a fair amount of grief. A lot of the harassment was from kids, and sometimes it was from younger children. And we worked with the Boston, the Civil Rights Unit of the Boston Police Department, the Community Disorders Unit. They were fantastic. They were amazing. They didn't make a lot of arrests, but they knew how to put pressure on through investigations and spending more time on a case that kids didn't think warranted it, you know, but they knew that once they said, if we can stop one kid, make one kid back off, 100 back off with them. That's what one of the sergeants said. So they were really good. Something happened politically that I think defamed them. And I probably shouldn't be saying that on video, but I think I know what it was, and it was politics. Somebody higher than them put some pressure on somebody, and they began to back off. Haven't heard much about them since. They were great.
Somebody who has worked and ministered this community for over 30 years, what would you like to see in East Boston?
Oh, well, I imagine people for generations ahead of me prefer to see East Boston the way it was then, which is how I feel now. That's the way I feel now. I look around and I see a very substantial mix of people, which I like. I know that East Boston has got a lot of people struggling, which means they don't have a lot of money, but they have a lot of spirit. And we have a whole bunch of mostly younger people who bought condos, moved especially into Jeffreys Point. I know some of them, and I'm really impressed with them. I mean, they're a real addition to the neighborhood. They're not pushing people out. They come after people have been pushed out and buy the available apartment. They don't have to know a thing about it. They didn't have anything to do with everything that happened in the meantime. But there's an apartment, and they rent it or they buy it. I wish it would stay a lot like it is if the Latin American community begins to more and more, if sort of prospering is broad-based. I don't know if it is or not, but if it could be, like the little stores, if at least a bunch of them can stay, leave the neighborhood having a lot of the flavor that it's had. It's an interesting place. A lot of the newcomers, they don't want to see it gone. They love it the way it is. I don't know if they all do, but I can't see why I would want the family groups, kids in public schools. There are any number of things that draw them together to be a community. Now, they also fight and fall apart, but there are lots of reasons, and it's harder, I think it's harder to draw together as communities without families. You can do it. There's a lot of powerhouse activists in the community that are single or just two people, but I don't think the dynamics draw you, in the same way that the undertow almost to other people whose kids go to the same school, who play soccer on the same team, who are both going to take the Latin test in the spring. I don't know. This is so much, and I hope we keep a substantial immigrant community. I hope that other groups can at least trickle in here. Some Africans. I don't know what our Muslim population is, but it's significant. It's not big, I don't think, but it's significant. And I'd love to see it have a mix like that. So it's not, so that you don't have to make $80,000 and $90,000 a year to live here. That's the projections, probably within another year or two at the current trends.
About a month ago, I learned that you celebrated 40 years of ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of those years have been here.
36 of them.
What's the meaning of East Boston personally for you?
Oh, well, I really didn't like East Boston, as you know, when I came. It was a couple of years. I remember about the end of the first year, I looked out the window one day and I said, yeah, but it is friendly. There was a kind of old school friendly banter that would go on in a market or something that was just fun sometimes. And I found the business people that we kept coming back into certain places. They know you, and it was something different. It was a little like growing up in a small town, which I did. Mm-hmm. It had some of that. The Martinos market here on the corner, which is now the laundromat, 3 Martino brothers, and to this day we call it Martinos. Where would they park? Oh, down by Martinos, Half a dozen years in, the work here was so exciting with refugees. It was dramatic. It was intense and tough, bad stuff and good stuff, but it was really still overall just powerfully meaningful. And in that you meet all the kind of people that step out and do community work everywhere around you. It's like they weren't there before, but they were. And so you get to know them all, and they become colleagues and friends, and they come over here and teach you how to do something because they know you don't know how to do it. So East Boston really won for me, and to this day now I was thinking this morning, I think it would be just terribly painful to have to retire outside of East Boston. But I live in the parsonage, which the church owns. And housing is so expensive now in East Boston that it's marginal. If I could buy a condo, but it might put me up against it. Mm-hmm. And then what? Am I going to move to well, you can't move to any other city neighborhood because they're expensive. Then I'm going to move outside the city because the houses are, I'm used to the house being next to you. I'm used to walking out on the sidewalk and my neighbor comes by. Or the guy walking his dog tonight, and I said, I was pointing him out. I said, see my dog out here? He said, that's your dog? I said, yeah, he just lives at Brian's house, But I mean, it's this, there's something about city energy that I love. East Boston's really got it in spades, and I love it. And I always say, just as soon be buried with the cat under the lilac bush out there, because that's where he went. So staying in East Boston, my daughter lives here and works down the street. My other daughter lives in West Roxbury and teaches at Revere, but that brings her back across town a lot, so we see the grad. It's just perfect. I like East Boston. I'm not afraid here. I love the energy. I just get off on it. I love the things people say and do.
As you see new generations coming in, what advice would you give to them about this place?
Oh, well, get connected. Don't just have a private life here and go somewhere else. What's really great about East Boston is not its nearness to downtown. That's really great, but what's really great here is all the people that are here that are, so many of them are just dazzle you once you get to know them, or work with them, or join in some struggle, you know. It's, that'll be the richest thing they'll ever know. So, and that's what happens here today with a soup kitchen. It's just absolutely astonishing what's going on here, because a few women said, let's have a soup kitchen and feed homeless people, and now they feed everybody. It's a huge mix, and I walk in here every week and I just go, I don't believe this. This is magic. I could be in a lot of places in a church that was much easier to be in than here, where you would usually find solid Lutheran churches. I guarantee you there would be no such soup kitchen. I can't guarantee you. There'd be somewhere, but it'd be very rare. And then it was created mostly by people that aren't part of the church. They just did it, needed the space here, moved over here, and somehow we're all one big partnership. And they're wonderful. I mean, I just feel lucky. As Britta points out, the theological word for that is blessed, to be here. And I felt that way for 30 years. It took a while. But then I started to realize what was happening to me. And I thought, how did I ever get here from there?
Thank you for those many years, and for the words of encouragement for the new generations who will come here and make this their community, their home. And God bless you, Father. We finished this interview on November the 29th, 2016. My name is José Alemán. We are doing this collection of testimonies for the project East Stories, promoted by Stand for Democracy and in East Boston. Thank you, Father Don.
The one piece of that bothers me, I don't know if you want this, but I'll just tell you, and then you can decide if you want it. Since City Life is here, I get some information or perspectives time to time. I'll ask Andres, what is happening here, but it's a good year ago that he told me about these 3 mega investors, huge investors. I mean, they have millions of dollars just to invest in East Boston. There were 3 of them, he said. And they have a lot of shells, they have a lot of corporations and whatever they call them, between them enough so that even the Inspectional Services Department downtown said, we're not always sure, but that one's a bad one. They said they named one of the 3. And the typical story told to me by a realtor who's got a house for sale for $600,000. Somebody knocks on the door and says, I'll pay you $650 cash. It's a done deal. So the money is there's no qualms about the money, and it's somebody's very big money from somewhere else. It's not that this young guy. In one case, it's the rumor which Boston, it was rumor or studies that Boston for Housing felt that it was lots of Chinese money, but wherever there are billions from other parts of the world to be invested to make a quick turnaround, you can make more money in housing in East Boston, I think, than you can make in Wall Street. And so that's a push factor. That's a tsunami. It's not just something economically is happening and there's a swelling number of people that want to live in the city, which is also true. So there's some things economically that are making a rising tide that's doing it. But that kind of money is like a tsunami. It pushes people out. It comes and buys buildings unofficially, off the record, telling apparently at least one landlord that if you can clean everybody out of this house, I'll give you so much money for it. That's illegal. But there's so many bad stories about the power of this money. And then there's smaller players who see an opportunity to buy a house and fix it up and turn it over, you know. But there were 3 big guys, and that would have to be updated, I'm sure. That's the part that bothers me the most. And I don't care if they build 11-story buildings on the waterfront, if that's what they did, but when they're buying up triple deckers all the way down the streets and insisting, offering $750 for something across the street from Holy Redeemer, I told Father Thomas that he wasn't going to do it. He wouldn't go with it. You know? I mean, it's ruthless, and the victims are going to be all renters, half of the population of East Boston.
What would be your strategy to counter from the community perspective, from the grassroots perspective?
It would be it would take a multi-pronged approach to even slow it down. I'm told by people who really know these things, you can never win, nor will you know what you've won when you win something. I know that City Hall, under its new Housing Sustainability Office, is pondering some very creative things, and seems to have a really strong commitment to take some strategies, which I don't know what they've decided, but just cause eviction helps. It's a little toothless, but it's pointed out to me that it will begin to document the evictions. You don't have any centralized documentation. The city can't tell you how many people have been pushed out by condos. I asked, the top people can't tell you. So now they'll have statistics. They'll start to see if there are big repeaters, for instance, that are involved in these things. Community Preservation Act, which is passed in November, will put some money. I mean, $20 million per year for a whole city is not a huge amount of money, but it will surely put some money in East Boston. It'll make a difference. I think that churches, I'm not sure how much effect this would have, but I think that so much of the talk is that it makes it sound like it's just economics. That's just the way economics work. That is the way economics works, except in this case, it's being driven by the major wealth, by people who aren't interested in East Boston if they live half a world away, but they like the money they can make from it, and we don't need to serve that interest. So I would hope, for instance, that if we could get the churches to begin to at least take a stand and be very public about it, at least maybe people who are sitting on the sidelines in East Boston, who are not, they know about it, but they may not be paying a whole lot of attention, such as videos that you're going to be doing. People start to hear stories, and they start to think, gee, that is, especially when they hear stories of some of the people who've been treated the worst. And the churches beginning to voice how this is central, absolutely central to the teachings of the Bible. Woe to you who add house to house and field to field, till there is no room in the land, no room in the middle of the land except for you. So that's one thing I would hope would happen. Grassroots organizations are mostly peace work, like this is peace work right here, getting stories told. It seems like that's what it's going to take, but then building a broad base of people who say, we don't want this to do all of this to us, all of this. Some of it's happening, but I don't know the particulars of the strategy in there, but I do know that there are people around that have some pretty good ideas that I hear.
As we will continue collecting these testimonies and stories, is a nice assurance to know that you are doing your work and having a strong presence in the community, providing a space, and especially spreading the message that from the grassroots we need to do something. As you said, not to oppose it, to slow down and doing it in a way that respects the dignity of all the residents.
Yeah, there must be something between the most ruthless forms of capitalism and doing nothing. There has to be something that can be done that makes for a type of capitalism that doesn't kill so many people to get what it wants.
Thank you.
Can I ask a couple of things?
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you say that house that sold for $650, how many people were living there, and what would happen to the property?
I don't know. the landlord, the realtor speculated that that particular guy was going to house students. And I don't know exactly why. Is that a temporary strategy before going condo conversion? Same thing happened across the street. There's a double building there. It's actually two buildings at 4 and 6 Winthrop, brick with those bow fronts. 8 Latin American families, at least 8, because there were 8 apartments, were evicted. Place sat empty for quite a while. One of the houses was listed for $750. Then we started noticing people carrying suitcases coming in, and we wondered if they were moving in or if it was Airbnbs. We don't know. We really don't know. I don't know who lives there, whereas I did know some of the people who lived there before. They were all young. They were all white. Some looked like students, some did not. But the tenants who were there had to go so that new tenants could come. I mean, I don't know. But now they have a project to take those 2 and make it a little wider into one large building, and so they're working on variances and such from the city to do it. So they had a wider scheme, but they have some preliminary action, and then move on to further when they're ready.
Do you know when places are turning into condos, how many people do they house and how much do they sell for?
Oh, it's 3 years ago that we decided to just to become acquainted. And at that point, and you can be sure they're much higher now, we saw a lot of condos listed down on the point that were running as high as 600,000 to 800,000. Not a lot, but some. And a lot of condos that were up in the high 4s, and some coming in under 400,000. We found one up on Leyden Street for $330, something like that. It was nice, but I didn't want to live there. And there was something that kept it from selling. Somebody knew something that we didn't know. So I'm going to guess that, I don't know, this would be a guess, that a median condo price, up on Jeffrey's Point could run somewhere around 500,000. A lot below that, but some way above that. I don't know, something like that. Stats will probably show
Scary.
it.
Could you say something this is completely different, but about what the Latino population is in East Boston, where they came from, and in what period, and under what conditions?
Oh, well, when we came here, there were a few Latin Americans here, and they were kind of mixed. I wasn't really too much aware. I knew of very few Latin American families. Our kids went to school, and we'd talk and stuff like that. But it's obvious that it was after the Central American Wars, and I suppose the war in Colombia as well, that just drove hundreds of thousands of people out of those countries and drive them out, but they had to go. It was just too violent, too dangerous. So one teacher in East Boston, she's in my Bible study group. She is teacher's aide, I think. She said, 19 of the 21 kids in my class were Salvadoran. Now, that isn't always true, but I think it's heavily. And I guess there are a lot of Colombians in East Boston. I don't know why they came. They may have different reasons. There was war in Colombia, or there may be other reasons, a mix of reasons why people are here. Outside of those two populations, I don't know much. There used to be a lot of Brazilians. I'm not sure if they're still here or if they've moved on. But obviously it was the wars in Central America, which you probably don't need me to give a national political perspective on for this purpose. But the violence now, I mean, I understand that. The violence in Guatemala, El Salvador, and perhaps Honduras is so intense. It is so intense. I don't know what the murder rate is, but it's many, 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 many times the murder rate in the United States. And especially against, I think, especially
Young
against
people.
young men. Although the woman who's been staying in the church here, her 72-year-old father was murdered last year in Guatemala. He was robbed and choked to death. And her husband was murdered a few years ago. That's why she came here. So the level of violence is just people are going, you know. That, and probably a draw toward what aren't great jobs, but are probably more money than they've had. But of course, then the costs are putting them back to, in some cases, harder places probably as far as economics. I don't know. Yeah, it's a woman in a neighborhood, this was a 50 plus black woman who finished her college. Oh, she must have been somewhere near 50 at the time, with children and grandchildren. Then went on to get her master's degree in psychology or social work from Salem State, and ended up on the BEST team, the emergency psychiatric team that goes. It's called out at night. You have a psychiatric emergency, and you call Mass General or somebody else. It's that team of however many people that go. Midnight, 1 a.m. There's something very dangerous. Somebody is very, very dangerous, has to be hospitalized. She was on that team, and she lived in Clippership, and she was a longtime city person. She grew up in New York. She said, "I'm amazed at the trauma I'm coming across in Latin Americans." And she named a woman. She didn't tell me who they were. A woman, 2 kids that couldn't even go to school. The PTSD was so severe. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't handle it. And others. She said she wanted to set up her own center here. But there were things going on in her life, and they moved. I wish she was here now, because she really was good at this, and she had massive credibility. You know, just her presence in the city neighborhood. She could handle anything you throw at her. She was very gentle. Must have been very tough. I'm sure she was. So, you know, trauma. She said she was just shocked at the level of it. And as an English speaker, no Spanish, I have no sense of that other than by secondhand. I'm not going to have a conversation that makes me feel it from a person. So it puts me very much outside of knowing it, other than just hearing about it.
Thank you, Don. Thank you.